Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Dr. Sarah Evans, Assistant Professor of Environmental Medicine and Public Health at Mount Sinai, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our 10th and final lunchtime chat in the Mount Sinai Institute for Exposomic Research, Environment and Health series. Today, we are thrilled to be joined by Dr. Rosalind Wright, who I will introduce shortly. The presentation will be about 25 minutes, followed by 20 minutes for Q&A. You can submit your questions using the Q&A function during the presentation, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. We've really enjoyed the great feedback and support we've received throughout this series. We've had about 600 individuals join us, and many of you have come back week after week. Our videos have been watched more than 1,000 times, and I hope that if the content has resonated with you, you will forward the videos to friends and encourage them to carve out 20 minutes to get more educated on how the environment affects health. I also want to thank those individuals who have reached out to me and other faculty with invitations to speak at community forums. Our community partnerships are a fundamental building block to our work and help us get the science to communities, families, and individuals. And lastly, I want to thank those of you who have joined our Exposomics and Children's Environmental Health community as donors. We look forward to sharing with you updates from our laboratories and our community work. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rosalind Wright. She's an internationally recognized clinician, scientist, and epidemiologist, co-director of the Mount Sinai Institute for Exposomic Research, Dean for Translational Biomedical Sciences, and the Horace W. Goldsmith Professor in the Departments of Pediatrics and Environmental Medicine and Public Health. Dr. Wright's research focuses on uncovering the causes of chronic childhood diseases like asthma through the exploration of the complex interplay between social determinants of health, things like exposure to stress, poverty, and violence, and environmental chemicals like air pollutants. Her findings demonstrate the importance of taking an exposomic approach to environmental health that considers exposures across the lifespan, and they have important implications for the creation of programs and policies that improve health outcomes for all. So with that, Dr. Wright, please take the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for the chance to speak today and the introduction, Sarah. Thanks for joining today, and really want to get through the presentation so we'll have plenty of time for your questions. As Sarah said, I'm going to focus today on social determinants, and I conceptualize that as social stress and how it might impact disease development. We're going to focus on asthma. For some of you who know me, I am a pulmonologist, so I do a lot of work in asthma in particular, and it turns out to be a good paradigm here to talk about the work that we're going to present today. And I really want to focus not only on risk, but how do we protect children? What can we do to protect against the health effects of stress? And what interventions and prevention strategies might we come up with? That's really been a major focus of my work since coming to Mount Sinai. So for those who may not be so familiar with asthma, what we're going to talk about today is the onset of early childhood asthma. Because again, we want to get to thinking about prevention. It starts very early. About 50% who are going to develop asthma develop it by the age of 3 years, and about 80% by year 5. So much of it does start in that early childhood period. It's a multifactorial disease. There is a genetic predisposition, and family history is important, but there's a very big part of it that's environmentally driven. Asthma is an allergic related disease, for example, and people think a lot about allergens driving it, but there are lots of other factors. And what we're going to talk about today is work I've done over the last more than 2 decades to think about how social determinants, things like chronic poverty and strain from that, exposure to traumatic types of stressors like violence, et cetera, and then just day-to-day life stressors that we all face, how that itself can be a risk factor that gets in the body, just like when you breathe in tobacco smoke or air pollutions or other chemicals that we think about. And as I said, we're going to look at modifiable resiliency factors as well as the risks. And how have we done this? How have we studied this in the work that we're doing in the epidemiology? It's really population-based studies. We know it starts very early, as I said, and even starts before the baby's born. So it starts in pregnancy. So we've developed a number of large pregnancy cohort studies. We recruit women during pregnancy. We ask them a lot of questions about stress, look for their biological response to stress, as well as measuring other environmental factors. And then we follow the kids over time for development of diseases like asthma. Fortunately, because it starts early in childhood, we don't have to follow them more than 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and we already are starting to see the effects. And that's what we'll talk about today. We again know multiple factors are at the root causes of onset of asthma, as pictured here in this slide. And we measure all of these, but we're going to focus on stress and how it independently is a risk factor, how it may enhance the effects of things like chemical exposures and pollutants, and then how it might interact with diet and nutrition to affect asthma risk as well. More that sort of comprehensive exposomic type of approach where we're measuring multiple things at once, and how do we start to put these things together and tease them apart. So the first question we set out to answer with some of these pregnancy cohort studies was, how does psychological stress get under the skin to influence respiratory health? I just want to give you a little bit of a picture in your mind to keep in mind as we go through some of the research findings. So we all are challenged every day with environmental stressors and things that we have to face in our relationships and our jobs and our work environment and our school environment, et cetera. And there are key systems in your body that try to help you respond to those challenges. And we think about these as producing stress hormones like cortisol through the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is pictured here on the left-hand side of this slide. Basically, when we encounter stressors or challenges, we weigh that against our ability to cope and the resources that we can sort of bring to bear to overcome those stressors or challenges. And when it overwhelms that, your body produces lots of neurohormones, neurotransmitters in the brain, gets disseminated through the bloodstream, interacts with other organ systems in the body, like the adrenal cortex, which sits over the kidneys that are pictured there. That whole mind-body connection. That's why stress gets into the body and disrupts your biology, just like breathing in an air pollutant, et cetera. But it's not just cortisol and that hormone pathway. That impacts the immune system. It can affect things like asthma, which we know is immune mediated, but also other key systems like the autonomic nervous system. When we get anxious or upset or stressed, you may feel your heart racing, you may feel, you sweat a little bit, your hands are clammy. That's the autonomic nervous system functioning. You're kicking out epinephrine, norepinephrine, things like that. And then oxidative stress balance is another key component. These systems are all talking back and forth to each other, and this is how we maintain health. We keep these in some optimal balance. And when things throw that out of balance, that's where you start to see toxicity and adverse health effects. Now, how does it start to affect the baby that mom's carrying? So mom, who is under stress, is going to disseminate all those neurohormones, neurotransmitters, et cetera, and that can pass through the placenta and have direct effects as well as indirect effects on the baby's developing key regulatory systems. Just like in the left-hand lower corner where you can picture how mom's smoking, and we know that's linked to poor growth in kids, early delivery, low birth weight, et cetera. You got to think about stress the same way, as well as air pollution, which is pictured up there, and we'll talk about a little bit today as well. So this is our design of our study. We have these moms recruited during pregnancy. We're going to measure stress as well as things that counterbalance that stress, social supports and things like this, and then look at that in relationship to lung growth and development, adjusting for all of these other environmental influences that we know are important to see independent effects. So how did we do it? We started a study, the ACCESS study, the Asthma Coalition for Community Environment and Social Stress in Boston, Massachusetts. And in the left-hand side, you can see as these communities that are pictured there go from lighter to darker shading, there's higher impact of the prevalence of asthma and the severity of disease and morbidity related to that disease. So you can see on the right-hand side, we recruited so that we could capture distribution across all of those communities and try to understand what's driving some of the differences in who's at risk in these lower income ethnically mixed populations, for example. And the first question we asked were, are children born to mothers who experience greater stress during pregnancy more likely to develop asthma? So we characterized mom's stress level based on a life event survey measure called the Crisis and Family Systems Survey. And that was a 64-item survey that captured experiences of stress across 11 different life domains. For example, financial strain, relationship problems, neighborhood and personal safety issues, et cetera. And then we just gave them a score over how many life domains did they report experiencing one or more of those life events over the past 6 months. And on that little guy running over the hill in the upper left-hand corner, that's the idea that you want to capture in your head. For me, I'm more likely to experience adverse stress effects when I'm having too many stressors at once and I get overwhelmed. So as you go up on that scale from 0, 5, 6, 9, and 10, 11, you're going to overwhelm those ability to cope, and you'll see health effects. And that's what we see, this straight line from, if you look at the bottom part of these graphs, 0 to 9 life domains that they're experiencing stress, you can see this very straight increasing line that says, as moms are experiencing more stress in the prenatal period, which is left-hand side, or over the first 2 years of the child's life, which is on the right-hand side in the box, you can see this very dose-dependent relationship. More likely to have kids who go on to develop early asthma, which was documented by repeated wheeze. And you can actually see from this graphic that those who had high maternal stress reported in both the pre and that early postnatal period, it's cumulative effects. And you can understand that if it goes on chronically over those periods, both periods, that's who was at the highest risk. This also tells you that you can intervene at different time points, the pre and the postnatal period. Even if you've had a lot of stress prenatally, there's a lot we can do in that postnatal period. We've done this in a much larger sample recently in about 500,000 children born in Denmark over between 1997 and 2004. We had some collaborators who came to us and asked, could we use their registry data and define early stress in that first year or two of life? And we did that by looking at adverse childhood experiences, loss of a parent or a primary family member, sibling, et cetera, for example, as a big stressor. And we characterized asthma phenotypes here, which are just in these graphics. It's just to show we can characterize kids who have onset from birth, who have, quote unquote, outgrow it by the time they start school, those who have persistent asthma over childhood, and those who develop it a little later at the time about school age. And then we looked at that in relationship to ACEs, which is adverse childhood experiences in that early postnatal period. And we saw a very dose-response relationship again with increasing ACEs and asthma risk in both boys and girls, as shown on this graphic. Well, that's great. So that we've shown it over and over again, not only in our own populations, we've helped others show it in their populations. But the other thing that we wanted to do is not just to understand independent effects of the stress, but we wanted to understand, does stress enhance the effects of other toxins like traffic-related pollution? In our cohorts here in New York City, that's a major exposure that we're interested in. And so we also characterized daily levels of air pollution exposure, and you may have heard about this in other talks that you've heard in this series. So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time. We just mapped where they live based on where people live during pregnancy. And we worked with our collaborators here in the Exposomic Institute to develop air pollution exposure data that we could link over the course of pregnancy on a daily basis. And then we published on that, looking at how it might relate to increased risk of asthma in these same kids. And just where it's circled there in the blue, this model shows us that yes, higher levels of particulate matter, which is a form of traffic-related air pollution, also increases risk for asthma in these kids. But if you divide it up by whether the kids were born to moms, again, with high or low prenatal stress, that air pollution was only toxic or only had an increased risk associated for asthma when you also had high levels of stress. So it's important to understand, because it might take us a long time to change the air pollution exposures, but maybe we can work on the psychosocial stress on a shorter time scale. So that, that points us to where we might pull on the lever to prevent disease. Well, then we wanted to show biologically, how does stress get under the skin to influence respiratory health? That helps showing how the mechanism, how does it get into the body? That sort of convinces folks in my world, the biomedical world, that this is something that's real. But it also shows us targets that we can follow as we do interventions to show that we're improving upon that underlying biology. So what's the mechanism? Again, these key regulatory mechanisms are the ones we've gone after. HPA axis function, or cortisol, that stress hormone level, is one of the first ones we looked at. We asked mom, as pictured here on the right, to take a cotton swab when she was pregnant, in mid-pregnancy, 5 times a day, take a sample of saliva for us. And then we can use that to measure cortisol production over the course of the day. And what we find is those who have a normal pattern of cortisol production, which we know from other work and other studies, which is shown in the dotted line, they were much less likely to go on and have children who developed asthma than those in the shaded line that had what we call a sort of flattened or blunted level of pattern of cortisol production over the course of the day. And then another biomarker that we looked at was something called telomere length on the end of our chromosomes, as pictured in the little cartoon, those little red caps. Those are known as telomeres, and as those shorten over time, they may be related to adverse health outcomes. And if a child is born with short telomeres at the time of birth, they're already at heightened risk, and that suggests increased exposure to something that's causing increased oxidative stress during pregnancy. And chronic stress is one of those things that is accelerating that telomere shortening. And this is sort of baby new year. You're just a baby, why do you have such short telomeres? We've shown that heightened stress in pregnancy is really one of the big drivers of that. And that one of the things that might be associated with it is higher levels of cortisol, as shown in these data. So it starts to tie all together. You have high levels of stress, disruption in these key regulatory systems, enhanced oxidative stress, more output of cortisol, et cetera. But what can we do about it? Now that we know that, seems to get biologically embedded, that is very convincing data that's come out of our group. Now others have been able to corroborate a lot of that. That's great. We think we needed to show that just to get people's attention directed towards this. But what we're really interested in is what can we do then to prevent stress-induced adverse health outcomes like asthma in children. So this is one of my favorite. This paper is just coming out, and I've been waiting to do this analysis for about the last 5 years as we've collected this data. And Allison Frost is a graduate student who did this as part of her thesis work during the pandemic. And what we wanted to look at is in our cohort of kids, now we followed them from pregnancy. These are the kids in New York City. We've looked at them over the first 6 months of life. We characterized early adversity, and then we showed that it was associated with increased repeated wheeze frequency when we followed the kids subsequently to 30 months. So by 3 years of age, yes, early adversity during that first 6 months of life is related to increased risk for an early marker of asthma, which here is just repeated wheeze, which is pretty standard in how we monitor that in this first part of life. So we've corroborated what we already know. In 676 mothers and children, we saw the same thing that we saw in 500,000 kids in that Denmark study, for example. And then we also show in the bottom, in that purple circle, we also collected saliva in our kids, as shown in the little picture there. And we showed already in the kids who were exposed to adversity, they're also showing that adverse blunted shape to their cortisol output, that dotted line in the graphic. And then we wanted to know, well, was the blunted cortisol slope, is that something that's mediating the effect on the repeated wheeze or the early asthma measure? It was, but we had to actually look within boys and girls to really see it. So it gets a little bit more complicated. There's a three-way interaction there. And kids with a blunt, this basically shows kids with a blunted cortisol slope are more likely to be the ones that were frequent wheezers, but it was really mostly in girls, not the boys. Now we wanted to see, was there something that we had measured in our population where we could look at it to see if it buffers this risk of living with high levels of adversity in those first 6 months of life, already having a disrupted cortisol pattern. Could there be protective factors perhaps that we could look at? And what we decided to look at was social networks. And one of the most important social relationship that tends to buffer toxic effects of stress is the maternal-child relationship in that early infancy period. So during early childhood, the stress response systems in that child is under very strong social regulation. And one of the most powerful environments that can shape that is the sensitive responding supportive care that they receive from their primary caregiver. That's been shown over and over in the developmental psychology literature. People have not looked at it as a potential buffer of toxic effects on physical health outcomes in kids previously. And that's what we wanted to do here with our asthma paradigm. So we had brought in our moms and babies into the laboratory, and we hooked them up to cardiorespiratory monitoring, their EKG, et cetera. And we measure heart rate response in the context of a stress challenge that we do and their ability to recover from that. We also took cortisol samples from them during the stress challenge and during recovery. And we can actually now characterize their stress response physiologically and how that might relate to risk going forward. But we also videotaped those sessions, and we could very carefully and in a standardized way code sensitive caregiving behaviors in the context of an observed laboratory visit. And this is a bit of a complicated slide, but what it shows is that even in kids who had high level of adversity in that first 6 months, they were already showing a blunted cortisol slope. If there was high supportive, sensitive caregiving that we coded on these observed videotapes, you could mitigate that effect. So there was no increased risk for wheezing in those kids. And it was really boys who were more protected in this instance than girls. That's not to say caregiving is not important for girls. The way we measured it, the type of approach that we measured it, that seemed to be playing a role more for the boys than the girls. So it was protective. That gives us something to hang our hat on and do in preventive work going forward. The other thing that we monitor is mom's diet. And we talked a little bit about this biomarker of oxidative stress, newborn telomere length. That's a biomarker of enhanced exposure, chronic exposure to oxidative stress is related to reduced telomere length at the time the babies are born. And here we map we also measured antioxidant intakes over the course of pregnancy, as well as a very broad assessment of maternal diet, but we focus here on antioxidants. And we can create an index, and that's on the bottom of this graph. And as that number goes from 0 to 100%, as mom's antioxidant intakes go up over pregnancy, you're more likely to protect that child from toxic effects on those telomeres. So they're born with much longer telomeres when mom's maintained a healthy diet, as measured by antioxidant index in this case. So here's another lever that can be done. You can counsel women, well, we can do things to enhance your access to healthy foods, enhance your diet that can protect you. Yes, we know there are these other risks. We're going to have to work on those from a public health standpoint, but what can we do right now? There are other components of diet that are very important when you're talking about respiratory disease. And another one that we focused on is omega-6 and omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids. We talk about that a lot, and you hear it about it a lot. Fish intake, fish oils, those kinds of things. Certain omega polyunsaturated fatty acids are anti-inflammatory, and they can actually protect against the toxic effects of things like stress, like air pollutants, like tobacco smoke as well. So these are two very strong levers that we think we can pull. And we sort of, you can envision sort of the life course and the developing lungs and the developing biological systems that interact with them to put somebody at risk for developing chronic disorders like asthma or not. And you got that little dial. And if we can understand what we need to measure as comprehensively as possible and identify who might be at risk. And boy, if we just tweaked your diet and enhanced this aspect of your nutrition, maybe we can put you back on this better trajectory. Also, we know that the caregiving environment, and this is something there are interventions, there are validated tools out there to develop an enhanced caregiving environment, et cetera. And we really are excited to move from risk factor research to this prevention types of studies now that we have these data. It's going to be very important. So this is kind of the big picture. We've been trying to disentangle what begets asthma. You can see we need this exposome framework. We need to measure many, many things. This doesn't even give you the complexity and the way that we're really putting these together in a big network type of approach. But it does show you why we need to do that. And looking ahead, it's easier to build strong children than to prepare broken men. So we really need to catch these kids early. We can actually prevent chronic disease. And I really think two of the big levers are going to be nutrition and this caregiving environment, as I presented to you today for asthma. But I can see how this is going to affect neurodevelopmental outcomes, not just neurobehavior, but cognition, sleep-related problems in kids, cardiometabolic risk, obesity, et cetera. And we're very excited to start to shift and make those kinds of discoveries here at Mount Sinai through our Exposome Institute. And I'm going to end there. And I think I'll stop sharing my screen and see what questions might have come up. Are we back?
Thank you so much, Dr. Wright. That was a really clear and informative talk. And we have some enthusiastic questions and comments coming in now. Some comments related to how great it is that you're looking at social determinants and that you're looking at the impact of stress. I think this is such an important direction for the field of environmental health. So we have a question, you spoke just now about catching this early and preventing asthma from developing and other problems from developing later on for these children. What about kids who are a little bit older or even adults who have been diagnosed with asthma? When is it too late to intervene, and what can we do, based on your research, what can we do to support those people?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And asthma is a life course disease, and it's expressed differentially over the life course. And people, quote unquote, outgrow it and then have exacerbations or relapse. Some of that might be triggered by your emotional well-being, for sure. So we think, based on the evidence that we have, about 20% of asthmatics, emotionally charged situations or stress, or however you want to think about it, is a trigger for those folks. And you can, I think, across your entire life, whether you already have asthma, whether you're trying to reduce your likelihood to develop health problems in general, reducing stress is a good thing to be thinking about and doing. And I've had many asthmatics that I've cared for, and I care for adults. I'm an adult pulmonary physician, so I do take care of adults, or had in the past. I do mostly research now. But I have had many people come to me and they can't get off steroids, or they have multiple hospitalizations and even intubations in the ICU or the intensive care unit for their asthma. And when you keep digging, there's a component that's stress related and psychological. And I've even had people go through cognitive behavioral therapy, et cetera, and been able to wean down a lot of these medicines. They have real disease, they need these medicines, but maybe they don't need all of it and have complications from it if you can do some of this as well. So it's an important part of our armamentarium and what we should be thinking about.
And I think, not surprisingly, a lot of people want to understand how we can counsel new moms, parents, pregnant women on stress reduction. And I think that's sort of a two-pronged question in terms of what can you do at an individual level to reduce your stress, but then maybe thinking more broadly at a systems level and a community level, are there programs and policies that can help to reduce stress for moms?
Yeah, I think the first thing we can do as care providers is to validate for people that this is critical, this is important. And it's not something that's in your head. This to me is like, and I would talk to people about this. This is just as if I were counseling you about the adverse effects of smoking during pregnancy and trying to do what we can to mitigate or, to prevent you from doing that and et cetera. It's the same kind of idea. And so what can we do? What can we do together? Do I need to refer you to counseling, something like this? Are there things that are going on that we think you could control or change in some way that could help? Social supports are very important. What kinds of things are you doing? Are you part of groups and these kinds of things? So there's lots of ways we can talk about it. Some of the centered pregnancy programs have shown that that's where you care for patients, and when they come into the office to see the obstetrician, they do it as a group and you share experiences. That has been something that's been very supportive for women as well. So there's a host of things that we can think about, but you're right, you can't just put it all on the individual, because there are a lot of upstream systems that are adding to that stress, or chronic poverty, for example. I was at an NIH conference once and somebody said, if you could do one thing to prevent most of childhood asthma, what would you do? And I said, fix poverty. Of course, it was like crickets chirping, but it's true. And so we do need to work at that level at the same time and provide supports for that.
Yeah, and related to that, we have questions about how we can support more sensitive caregiving relationships between moms and infants. And I think that particularly applies in situations where moms are already very stressed, maybe returning to work, don't have a lot of time to build that caregiver-child bond. Do you have any comments on strategies that might work in that regard?
Yeah, that's what I was talking about. I mean, my next phase, and one of the reasons I moved to Mount Sinai was because I wanted to sort of shift, sort of challenge myself to how do I take this information, this data that we're getting, the science that says early life stress is related to the onset of asthma. How do we turn that into an intervention? Well, you need to start early. So I needed to be in a department of pediatrics. That was one thing. And I needed to get the evidence base, build the evidence base that said this could potentially work, to get the funding to do it. And that's what we have with that data I just showed you. I think we're there now. And I think that there are out there, our developmental psychology colleagues have developed valid tools to teach, observe parents and interacting with their children in the home environment, in other environments, and actually give them tools, right, to enhance the caregiving environment. And quite honestly, it benefits the mom as well as the child. So even when there are these other challenges, they're working 2 jobs and they're doing this and there's time, you can teach in the context of that. But again, at the same time, we have to build a society that supports young families so that they are able to do this without being so challenged and stressed.
We have some questions about inequities and health disparities, and a lot of the exposures that you're studying, like exposure to air pollutants, as well as early life exposure to violence and trauma, we know are more prevalent in underserved Black and Brown communities. And there are some questions asking whether you've been able to include racial oppression and things like community police violence and other forms of systemic oppression in your studies, and can you maybe talk a little bit about why we see these inequities and disparities and what we can do about that?
Yeah, well, there's a lot there. Absolutely, another big driver of why I do it, and you remember the map I showed of the communities that are more impacted and the studies we've designed around that. I really do want to understand what's driving the health disparities. And when you talk about the social environment, it really is, a lot of those communities are exposed to higher levels of crime, higher levels of violence. That's not because of who lives there, who makes up those communities. It's because resources have not been invested in those communities. It's because people don't have the job opportunities, the educational opportunities, et cetera, that other communities might have to sort of build wealth and bring these resources to bear. In their communities. So we do need to be thinking about that for sure. We have teased out violence exposure, racism, discrimination, experiences of racism, discrimination, interactions with authorities, and that includes police. And so we can take that apart a little bit from those larger life event measures that we look at. And I can tell you that the trauma, I didn't get to show you a lot of that today, but it is the traumatic types of stressors. It is the chronic racism, discrimination that is driving a lot of this in those communities. And if you look at cortisol, for example, and what drives elevated cortisol in those women, if you parse that out by African-American, Latina versus the Caucasian subgroups, it's violence exposure, it's traumatic types of stressors that's driving it. And it might be something that happened to mom long time before that pregnancy. It could have happened in her own childhood. So we are looking at that level of complexity because it says there's a different intervention for that woman, right? Different things we need to think about as well.
Adding on to something that you just said, can you comment on the mechanism by which mother's early life exposure to violence and trauma and stress could impact her future offspring?
Yeah, I mean, it just as I talked about, that little guy running over the hill, and then that the key regulatory systems that we think about that are being shaped. Mom is during her childhood, that's a vulnerable period for mom too, to shape those key regulatory systems. And if she's in an environment that has chronic, poverty, other adverse childhood experiences like, witnessing violence in the home, witnessing violence in the community, being a direct victim of that kind of violence herself, it's going to already shape the biology. And she's going to carry that throughout the rest of her life into her reproductive years. And so she now comes into pregnancy, right, with this disrupted cortisol productive, pathways, disrupted autonomic functioning, et cetera. So when she faces the day-to-day challenges over that pregnancy, that's going to shape what that kid is experiencing biologically through that placenta, if that makes sense. So it's very important. And I had a hard time selling that when I was getting funding early on, that I needed to understand what would happen to mom way back when, not just now, to really understand this picture. It's critical, and it's critical in how we, care for that mother and her babies.
Yeah, and again, suggests multiple time points for intervention, which I think is hopeful as well.
Absolutely.
We have another question about, could you get into a little bit more what you think the mechanisms for sex differentiated effects of stress on asthma might be?
Yeah, well, that's fascinating to me. If you look at the natural history of asthma, for example, it starts early in childhood, as I said, but boys are more vulnerable than girls to develop asthma in childhood. Prior to school age, early school age, it's boys 2 to 1. As you then go through into pre-adolescence into adolescence, another big shift in development there, it flips. It's now girls 2-to-1, and that pretty much carries through the rest of life. And there's differences to the biology of that asthma when you get down and start looking at it. There's lots we still need to learn, but we do know enough to say that. And actually, if you look at stress, you also have to have that timing in your mind. In these longitudinal studies that start in pregnancy and early childhood, middle childhood, et cetera, measure it repeatedly. Because we actually have shown, and I didn't get a chance to show this today, but boys are more vulnerable to the stress prenatally, but girls take the hit postnatally. So they may be protected somehow for some evolutionary reason. And I think that has to do with the ontogeny of their immune systems and how the HPA axis is differentially vulnerable to disruption from those types of challenges. And that's true. There's lots of literature in the developmental literature to say that. So it's interesting. You see that this different timing effect as well. We have to do that, and we have to set up studies where we're biobanking frequently over that time, so we can really do much bigger network analysis, omics types of analysis to really figure out what that is and what signals might tell us early before somebody develops a disease. When they present to me as a doctor, they're well down that road. We really need to do this early.
Quickly, because we're almost out of time, but we have a really good question about whether there are any stressors that have been looked at in fathers, either currently or during childhood, that might affect child health outcomes.
People have looked at that some in relationship to fertility issues, sperm function, these kinds of things. Haven't carried that through so much to how it affects child's asthma. People have looked at dad's functioning, dad's psychological well-being. Yes, it's important. Dads are very important. And I want to say that. And I think a lot of the reasons we've focused a lot on our moms in our cohorts is we really wanted to look at domestic violence as an exposure. And that turned out to be a safety issue for us. And so that's just a design issue for us. It's not to say dads aren't important. And there are data out there to show that. And we do need to start doing that and looking at that as well more definitively. We do ask questions about partner support, et cetera. It's very important to our moms. It's another buffering effect. I'm sure you could look at it the other way, reverse that and look at it, how it affects dads too, health.
So the last and final question to wrap up, can you just quickly talk about where you see this work and exposomic research going in general in the next 5 to 10 years and how this might inform clinical care and public health strategies?
Yeah, I really think for, what I'm excited about is doing some of this prevention research. We have the cohorts set up. We know what exposures and what their biology looks like prenatally in that first 6-month period. Now let's put an intervention on top of that and really show, and Mount Sinai could really lead the way here. We can show that we're going to prevent, we're going to change this trajectory, we're going to reduce chronic disease, asthma, but as I said, you can look at it even more broadly. I would like that. I would like to work with our data scientists to really take a look at the biomarkers on a much bigger scale, like we do genomics, the whole genome. We want to do the whole exposome. We met, social as well as physical. And really, what are the signals? Start to boil it down for something that you can give to a clinician that says, look at this person, this is what they're looking like. We know these puts them on a certain trajectory, but if we do this and this, maybe tweak the diet, maybe do this or that, we can actually put them on a better optimal developmental trajectory. I'd love to get there. Will we be there in 5 years? I don't know, but 10 years, I think we could if we really continue to build what we're doing here in the Exposome Institute and really pull in our data scientists and all the folks that we really need to help us take on this bigger and bigger data.
Well, I think that we are at the end of our time. So thank you so much, Dr. Wright. And before we close, I just want to ask everyone if you could complete the evaluation form for this talk. You can take a picture with your smartphone and it will link right to that survey. And a couple of quick announcements. As we said, closes out our series of lunchtime chats. Next week, we'll be sending you links to all of the videos from the series. If you have additional questions or you would like to discuss inviting any of our faculty to speak to your community, you can email us at exposome@mountsinai.org. And starting in July, we're going to be sending out simple tips based on what you heard throughout this series that can help you make small changes to create a safer home and a community. And we're going to include some easy, fun activities for the kids in your life. And so we hope you'll join us and that by the fall, you'll feel empowered to make more informed choices. I want to thank Dr. Wright again for closing out this series, and to everyone who has joined us, have a wonderful summer, and we look forward to being in touch. Thank you.